Right, thank you, Georgia, and obviously thank you in advance for Hugh. We're all looking forward to this immensely. Now, my job is just to make a couple of quick connections so that we can get on with the meat. And just to say that I first met Hugh back in 1990 when he took up a Rome scholarship at the British School at Rome. And it was really enthusing actually to meet someone who has that scholarship, who actually has interests in tradition and history. So that was the start of a long friendship for which been developing and watching Hugh kind of grow and everything that's been happening and all his achievements and interests has been really fantastic. And without going into a kind of long CV, because it would be very long, let's just say the main points. Clearly, a director at Adam Architecture, where there are now about 160 people. So that's pretty significant. And we're going to see a lot of projects coming out of, if you like, Hugh's stable. And Hugh is also, I think, more than most other comparable individuals, does an awful lot around the kind of the whole world of traditional values and the value of tradition, as the title of his talk is, and the living tradition of his book. He's been vice chairman of the Georgian Group. He's been a chairman of the Art Workers Guild, a trustee, and then instrumental with others of founding the foundation course at the Prince of Wales Institute, and served, in lots of ways, and really very, very encouraging for younger people. And coming up and convincing them that actually their enthusiasms and energies can actually bear fruit. So it's a really special player in the field. So really, I don't think I should say any more, except that we should get on and hand the floor over to Hugh and enjoy what he's going to tell us. So, Hugh, over to you.
Please share your screen, Hugh.
Thank you very much. Let me just do that first, and I'll hopefully you can all see that.
Yes,
Um,
seems good.
Yes, perfect.
Presenter view.
there we
Perfect.
are. Mark, thank you very much indeed for that very kind and generous introduction. And as you say, we've been great friends for over 30 years now, and it's exciting to see how the whole traditional movement has grown over that time. Um, Robert Adam is also on the call tonight. He and I have been friends for a similar amount of time, and we worked together for most of that as well. And in our time, we helped to found the Traditional Architecture Group, and it's been wonderful to see how it has grown as a group and the age range of people now involved with it. And I'm very pleased indeed to be here tonight to talk to you. The subject of my talk, as you say, is the value of tradition, a personal journey. I gave a version of this talk last year in America for the McKim Lecture for the Institute of Classical Architecture and Art. I've tailored it a bit for tonight, but hopefully it will give you a reasonable idea of how my own interest in tradition evolved and influenced initially in no small way by Robert's thinking on the subject, and how it's developed over time as my academic career sort of morphed out into practice, and how I've tried to draw the strands together. So as a child, I always had a strong interest in architecture. Both my parents were interested as well. And so I was taken to see lots of buildings as a child, and we usually holidayed in Britain as well. And I think it's fair to say that Britain is unusual in having an extraordinarily diverse geology, which gives each part of the country its own distinctive character. It makes it distinctive not only in the types of trees and the way it's farmed, but also the materials which are available for building, which gives each area its own particular distinctive vernacular form of architecture. And as a child, I spent much time looking at the front pages of Country Life each week, trying to identify and work out which part of the country the buildings came from. So just to give you a flavour of that, the slide on the screen just now is an oak frame building from Cheshire. Sorry, I'm just... Here we are. Here, the slide on the screen is Arlington Row, a famous medieval row of stone cottages with stone slate roofs at Bybury in the Cotswolds. Here's a building from the west coast of Scotland made of basalt volcanic rock with rough cast lime render and a slate roof. And then this building is what's called a longhouse from Devon in the southwest of Britain, where the walls are made of rammed earth with a lime render on the outside, and the roof is made of thatch. And in parallel with the vernacular interest that I developed as a child, I also was going to see different parts of the country, and I got a strong appreciation of traditional styles of architecture. I show here a slide of Cambridge, obviously the backs of Cambridge, very distinctively British in my mind, because although it has a mixture of Gothic and classical buildings, they're all used in a way which is very particular to this country. So on the left, the building is obviously King's College Chapel, and then the Gibbs building at King's College on the right-hand side. And then this building, one of my favorites, known as Horse Guards in London. Originally, it was an entrance to the Palace of Whitehall behind the building on this screen view here. And after that palace burnt down, it was then used the other way as the entrance to St. James's Palace. And obviously today it's where the head of the London, the household division in the army is based, and where the trooping the colour and so on takes place as well. The building is by William Kent and John Vardy, and again, to my mind, is a very particular idiosyncratic form of classical architecture, which is unmistakably English or British. So I went off to Portsmouth Polytechnic in the 1980s. It happened at the time to be the only school of architecture in Britain where traditional and particularly classical design was taught by an unfortunately deceased man now, Peter Hodson, and the head of school was Geoffrey Broadbent, who some of you may have come across. And it was there really my interest in tradition was ignited, but it was not an altogether easy experience, because in the 1980s, when I was a student, the style wars were raging, and a lot of academics and indeed some of the other students thought that any interest in traditional design was morally wrong and should be discouraged as much as possible. So whilst I was a student, I became very interested in the arts and crafts movement, which took place in Britain, or started in the 1870s and 1880s. And as many of you, I'm sure, will know, it was inspired in turn by the philosophy and ideology of the Gothic revival, which had begun some decades earlier in the 19th century. And two great proponents of that on the left-hand side, Augustus Welby Northmore Pugin, and on the right-hand side, the art critic John Ruskin. The slide I show you here is a page from Pugin's book Contrasts, which on the top of the image shows the awful modern squalor of the urban poorhouse, contrasted with the lower image, which is an idealized, self-sustaining medieval monastic community. And if you notice, the top one is classical and the bottom one is Gothic. And the message, therefore, is very much that Gothic is the style for a better quality of living and not the oppressive classical style. It was a reaction against that. This time in Europe, really, and indeed in some ways the wider world, was a time of profound political change. In 1871, Italy became a country. In 1870, Germany became a country. And with that rise of nationalism, which came from that, and the informal British Empire, which had existed in that until that point, and then you get empires forming from other European countries as well, there was definitely an increasing sense of nationalism. And for many people, the Gothic architecture was seen as a distinctive national style. And so anyway, the arts and crafts movement is rooted very much in the ideology of the Gothic revival and an interest in how the arts could be woven into architecture in a Gothic style. So one of the key proponents of the arts and crafts movement, I show you here a portrait of William Morris, whose own ideals were very much rooted in the Gothic tradition, and who inspired a whole new generation to look more carefully at the vernacular traditions. I think those of you who have been to the Art Workers Guild in Queen's Square will see the bust of Morris above the master's chair. At this time also was the rise of the arrival of railways in Britain, which meant that families who had a financial connection to London or one of the big commercial cities could afford to move out into the country and then to commission arts and crafts houses that drew upon local vernacular traditions. And this was very much the context for the rise of the arts and crafts country house. So I show you here William Morris's own house, known as the Red House in Bexley Heath, south of London, designed by the architect Philip Webb in 1859. This is a house called Stonywell in Leicestershire by the architect Ernest Jimson, 1898, so a bit later. And you can see it's quite distinctive and quite different, those two. And then this house on the screen now, 48 Stories Way in Cambridge by Hugh Mackey Bailey Scott. And again, it's quite distinctive in using materials and building forms which are particular, in this case, to East Anglia. And through my interest in the arts and crafts, and in particular why the first generation of arts and crafts architects whose work was rooted in the Gothic, in their later work, they seem to refer more and more to classical architecture, which on the face of it was a contradiction. And in reading around the subject, and I'm sure many of you are familiar who've read about the 20th century in architecture, there's a common view that the arts and crafts movement in Britain was the natural seed ground for the advent of modernism as a style. But in fact, it became clear very quickly by going back to the primary source material that things were not quite what they seemed. And the slide on the screen is Nicholas Pevsner, who's written many books on this subject. And you can see the two other images, Voysey's house on the top of the screen, and then the Villa Savoye on the bottom, that the white walls and the long horizontal windows, there is a certain physical connection between the two, but the ideologies, when you go back to look at the primary source material, tell a very different picture. And then later on, as you can see in the quote I put on the slide, Goodhart Rendell, who's another historian of the period, and Pevsner in his later life acknowledged that whilst Goodhart Rendell was biased against modern architecture, he was perhaps rather biased in favour of it. And so I was curious as to what actually happened for that late first generation of arts and crafts architects, why they, from their Gothic roots, they moved into classical design, and also to understand a bit more what happened in terms of modernism and where that fitted into this picture. So I found this rather wonderful quote from William Letherby, another arts and crafts architect, and I'll read it to you in a minute. But in essence, what happened, in fact, is that the ideals of the arts and crafts movement were exported to Germany, to the Bauhaus, and it was there that the germ of modernism developed, and it was then re-imported as a style back into the UK. So it was not a natural extension of arts and crafts principles from our own country. And you can see in Letherby's reflection on the period, and I will read it out for you in case it's rather small on your screen. The old modernist style is now regarded as a style, whereas being truly modern would simply mean being right and reasonable. Reasonable building is not necessarily a series of boxes or a structure of steel. The most scientific and sensible building for given conditions might still be brick and thatch. I greatly fear that a modernist fashion will be imported as a style and not arrive as a natural growth from our own sound building customs. Modernism, as an inverted archaeology, is quite a different thing from experimenting ourselves and from being modern. And then the conclusion, beware of a style called modernism. And so you can see that this for me was a revelation, because I was a student at a time when we were told by many tutors that anything that wasn't modern was morally wrong, and this was really what had to happen. And it was very much a self-conscious condition about what styles you should and shouldn't design in. And in understanding this period a bit more, it became increasingly apparent to me, certainly as an architect, that actually it was about being right and reasonable. And because we're all individuals, style effectively is like a form of writing, and it's very much personal to the individual. Even today, if you look at the classical architects, you can usually tell who's designed a particular building, because we all use traditional languages in a particular idiosyncratic way. But for me, at the time of this research I was doing for my dissertation, it was very much a revelation, and had a huge influence on my subsequent career. And it meant, just to sort of show visually, that the Windsor chair on the left-hand side could be just as modern as Rietveld's chair on the right. And there was no particular stylistic distinction. No, what one was right or wrong. It was just very much a personal interpretation of what felt right and reasonable to you. So that answered the question about the connection between the arts and crafts movement and modernism. But there was still this lagging question as to why the later work of the first generation of arts and crafts architects moved increasingly to classicism. So I show you here some examples. This is the Institute of Chartered Accountants in London by John Belcher and Beresford Pite in 1893 in Swan Alley off Moorgate. This is a house called Standon by Philip Webb, who you may remember designed William Morris's house. This again is 1890s, and you can see it's got sash windows and other classicizing elements to it. And then this house a little bit later, 1905, Debenham House in West London by Halsey Ricardo, where you can see it's in full-flown classical language, but with arts and crafts materials and detailing with these rather beautiful faience and ceramic tile decoration. So I think on the one hand, Mike, the conclusion of the question about why the architects moved towards classicism and away from the Gothic, I mean, there was issues of economy, and I think Gothic buildings are very expensive and take a long time to build. They're often quite dark and dingy, and in a time of economic boom, being able to build quickly and beautifully with light rooms and so on was very attractive, but also a realization that it was possible to bring together the arts in a classical building in the same way it was within a Gothic building. But I think thirdly, there's a realization of the influence of Georgian pattern books on the English architectural traditions, and really how you could argue that it was in fact a vernacular English classical tradition as part of our sort of national style or national distinctiveness. And maybe I'm biased because I have a particular affection for Gibbs, but in my mind, the architect James Gibbs is one of the most profound influences of that period from his pattern books. He spent a long time in Italy, working in Rome as an architect before returning to Britain and publishing his pattern books, the first time in a beautiful leather-bound edition. And then he published them again with a penny a week for one page. And so because of this very astute commercial proposition, it meant not only rich people, but also craftsmen, whether it was stonemasons or carpenters and joiners, could also acquire their own pattern book of classical design. And for this reason, the Gibbsian vernacular classical tradition is probably the strongest of any of the pattern books in the UK. One of the features particularly distinctive of Gibbs, as you look at the door case on the right-hand side of this slide, is what's known as the tripartite keystone, the three-part keystone at the top of the door. And just as an example here, this is a townhouse in Stamford in Lincolnshire. We don't know who the architect was. It was probably just built by a local stonemason. But you can see the very strong use of rusticated surrounds, including the distinctive tripartite keystone, so that we know from that detail alone that whoever designed and built this building was heavily influenced by James Gibbs. One of the best known of the sort of later clutch of early arts and crafts architects, of course, was Sir Edwin Lutyens. I'm sure known to many people on the talk tonight, arguably best known for his early work in the Surrey Hills, where he grew up south of London, and his adaptation of the vernacular of the Surrey Hills into his early arts and crafts houses for those wealthy professional people who moved out of London because of the advent of the railway. And again, as I'm sure as many of you know, he was not a well child, and so he didn't attend school very much, but instead would spend his time walking around the villages of the Surrey Hills and talking to the carpenters and craftsmen as they went about their work. And through that process, he learned a lot of practical geometry. And just as an example of that, the roof of 45-degree pitch that many of us might sort of normally use, Lutyens called the ugly angle, claiming it was neither steep nor shallow. And what he called the magic angle was a very particular roof pitch of 54 degrees, 45 minutes. And you might think, well, why on earth is that a magic angle? And the answer is because if you have two planes of roof that meet at that angle, on the hip board on the corner of the roof, all the compound angles that the carpenter cuts are 45 degrees. So from a practical construction point of view, it makes the whole construction of the roof so much easier. And the steeper pitch helps with throwing off water and throwing off snow. So it has a practical advantage for clay tile roofs as well. Some other examples of his work. This is one of his early buildings, Munstead Wood, for Gertrude Jekyll, the famous landscape architect. And you can see the strong chimneys and steep roofs are very much part of the core character of that building. Slightly later one, the Deanery Gardens in Sonning, on the Thames in Berkshire, and then the house he did, the Dower House for his in-laws, Homewood in Hertfordshire in 1900. And you can see at Homewood, this last slide, that he's starting to integrate classical details with the rather idiosyncratic use of Ionic pilasters on those three bays in the middle of the elevation. And you can see he's fused that with the steep roof and the other details from his earlier buildings. And then later on again, 1906, Heathcote House in Ilkley in North Yorkshire, which is his first full-blooded classical design, as you can see on the screen just here, because it's an adaptation of principles from San Michele. As Mark said at the start of this talk, I had indecent luck, which is a thread that runs, I'm afraid, through much of my career, but I had the indecent good fortune to win 2 Rome scholarships in architecture. And for those of you approaching that stage in your career, I would encourage you very much to look at the British School at Rome. There are 3 scholarships there. The main scholarship, there's the Robert Adam Rome Scholarship that Mark and I and Robert are trustees of, for people with a particular interest in traditional architecture. And then there's also one named after Giles Worsley, who was a friend of ours, for people who have a more academic interest in the subject. When thinking for myself what a theme might be for my time in Rome, you have to describe a program of research. I became interested in what was happening at the Rome at the same time as the arts and crafts movement was underway in Britain from that earlier work I've shared with you tonight. And in particular, what happened in Rome between 1871, when Italy unified and the capital moved back to Rome, and 1911, when there was an international exhibition in Rome to celebrate 50 years of the state of Italy, which was declared 10 years before Rome was taken again in 1861. And I show you on the screen now 2 sculpture groups from the Gallery of Modern Art in Rome, which was built as part of the 1911 exhibition in Rome. And if you look carefully, you can see the ladies on the left-hand side, which are known as winged victories, with their laurel wreaths that they're proffering, are quite modestly attired. And in 1861, the Pope was the ruler of the Papal States in Rome. And 1911, when the House of Savoy took over and the Catholics were pushed back to the Vatican, it was a time of liberation, and hence you can see the ladies there are rather less modestly attired. So it's an amusing example of how sculpture can be used to convey political messages. So in 1870, Rome was extraordinarily backward. It had a population of about 20,000 people. 70% of those people were illiterate, and the river flooded several times a year, and the whole feeling of the city was very picturesque, but very decayed. And I'll show you a series now of watercolors by an artist, Ettore Rosla Franz, which capture, just to help you understand what the challenges were when this became the capital of a new united Italy. I might say also that the whole point of making Rome the capital, and you might think looking at these slides what a daunting task it was because with a new nation, you needed to give it an identity. And obviously from antiquity, Rome has always been a place of particular cultural significance. And therefore the challenge for those who are looking to forge this new state was how you could create a new city on top of the old that would unite the identity of the nation with the glories of Rome's past. And this last slide shows one of those floods which I mentioned early on. And as I described earlier, this time of the 1870s, the rise of nationalism with Italy forming and Germany forming at the same time. There was a rush across Europe to create grand imperial capitals. A lot of work was done in London at that time. Paris, as we know, with Haussmann, was going through a radical period of transformation. And similar things were happening in Berlin and Vienna and other places like that. And the challenge then was for the new regime in Rome was for a state which was actually very poor, how they could transform this picturesque but very decayed city into one that would work as a modern European capital without spending more money than they had and without erasing what was important about the significance of the buildings of Rome's past. The project was undertaken through a master plan and through codes, and I'll come on to that in a minute. But the slide I'll show you here is what's known as the Star Plan of Rome, designed by Pope Sixtus V at the end of the 16th century. And it shows the main basilica churches in Rome, centered on Santa Maria, you can see in the middle there, and then how the processional routes that link these churches together for religious ceremonies. So the slide I show you here is the 1873, the first master plan for Rome after it became the capital of the new country of Italy. And you can see, I don't know whether you can see my cursor, but on the right-hand side of the screen is the church, like I mentioned before, Santa Maria, which is the center of the Star Plan of Rome. And then you can see a number of axial routes which go back through what was at that stage a suburban area of lush Renaissance villas and connects the routes right back into the heart of the medieval city. And so the new quarters of Rome were very much laid out around those Sixtus V's arterial routes, both on the Escaline Hill on the left-hand side of this slide, and then also around by the Vatican on what's known as the Prati by the Castel of Sant'Angelo, on the edge of Trastevere, the area on the left-hand side, on the west bank of the Tiber, and then down at Testaccio, the bottom area at the bottom of the slide. And then in contrast with Paris, where whole swathes of the city were demolished to create grand new axial routes, as I say, there wasn't the money in Rome for that same attitude of wholesale demolition, but also there was the whole reason not to, because of this issue of ideology and linking with Rome's past. And at the same time, they needed to open up some of the medieval routes to accommodate modern volumes of traffic. And so within the heart of the old city, grayed out on this particular master plan, as you can see, there are a number of black routes where the significant monuments from earlier ages were identified by the master planners, and then they drew the best straight line through those, widening streets and creating new streets to open up the tight medieval fabric to integrate it to the new areas as well. And of course, this is a completely different and much more picturesque approach to town planning than you saw in any other European capital at that time. Moving on to architecture, the predominant architectural style in the city was known as the Neo-Cinquecento or Neo-High Renaissance, and most of the architects working in Rome at that time had trained at the ancient Accademia di San Luca, which is really the inspiration for the École des Beaux-Arts in Paris. And it's quite possible to go back and look at the curriculum of how these people were taught, but really time had stood still there, and Vignola's treatise on the classical orders was reprinted frequently with the same material being regurgitated time and again in special Roman editions, picking up particular Roman details and offering them up to the next generation of architect to create this sort of local classical architectural tradition. So looking first at plans, we all know the Palazzo formula of buildings arranged around the courtyard with a staircase off to the side. And here is the plan of Palazzo Farnese in the center of Rome. In the 16th century, Bartolomeo Amanati had a treatise called La Città, where he began to explore the idea of creating larger palaces with two courtyards, but divided in the middle by a grand staircase or scalone. So this was an idealized project, but beginning to think about how the Palazzo formula could be adapted to accommodate a new scale and type of building. Later on again, in the 18th century, an architect, Ferdinando Fuga, actually built the palace I show you the plan of here, Palazzo Corsini in Trastevere, to a similar concept. So you can see the idea of adapting a traditional plan form is something which carried on down the generations, with one generation learning from the next and adapting them to suit the needs of their time. Going back to the late 19th century, the image I show you here is one of the most prominent architects of that period, a man called Gaetano Koch, who when he died was heralded in his obituary as Il Principe degli Architetti Romani, the Prince of Contemporary Roman Architects. So quite an accolade for him. And he was one of the most prolific architects, Roman born and bred, Roman trained, and then had a very significant role, not only in the master planning of Rome from the slide I showed you a few minutes ago, but also a number of the most significant buildings of that time as well. Amongst the buildings of that era, which he was responsible for, was the new central bank of Italy, the plans of which I show you here. Again, you can see a huge palazzo with two courtyards separated by a grand staircase. Externally, the building is quite restrained, again, quite neo-Cinquecento in style, betraying his training, I guess, at the Accademia di San Luca with stacked orders on a rusticated base. And then if you look carefully, there's a shot of the staircase on the left-hand side. On the right-hand side, there are these rather curious ship's prows. You may have seen those in London too. They're on the Selfridges building in Oxford Street and on the Victoria Monument in front of Buckingham Palace and other places as well. And they are actually an antique symbol of victory from the Romans' Battle of Antium in 338 BC, where the prows of enemy ships were removed and carried back to the Forum in Rome, where they were installed on the speaker's rostrum. And over time, they became recognized as a symbol of power and victory. And they're known as rostra, even to this day. And so, hence, because of the power of the new central bank, it was appropriate to adorn those, in his mind, with this antique symbol. So, on the one hand, the Central Bank of Italy was an unprecedented scale of building, adapting a traditional form to accommodate a new administrative building. And then later on, the ministries have sometimes 4 or even 6 courtyards, taking the same principles and extracting them, adapting them again. And at the other end of the scale, the Palazzo Formula was adapted to create middle-class flats for the new class of administrators who were brought in to lubricate the machinery of the new state. I mentioned the republication of Vignola's treatise. For those of you who are interested, on the left-hand side is the Doric order of the Theatre of Marcellus in Rome. Unusual for 2 reasons, really. First of all, that the bed moulding in the cornice is a dental course, which is a form normally associated with the Ionic order, and also that the top moulding, rather than being an S-shaped cyma moulding, is a concave curvetto moulding, so very idiosyncratic detail. On the Theatre of Marcellus, there's no base to that order, so it's very much more of the kind of Vitruvian Doric. And on the right-hand side is Vignola's version of it, where you can see that the entablature is a copy of the Theatre of Marcellus, so again, a Roman detail from antiquity. But Vignola suggests it should have a different kind of base, and his own particular idiosyncratic of the Tuscan base, which is normally a 1-torus base, is a 2-torus base, where you get 2 bullnose mouldings, one on top of the other, which is again an idiosyncratic Vignola detail, which gives you, whenever you see that, you know it's come from his particular treatise on the orders. Another example, the top of this slide is the composite order from the Colosseum in Rome, which has, as you can see if you look carefully, an S-shaped cyma reversa bracket to stiffen the crowning cornice of the Colosseum. And those of you who've seen the film Gladiator will know that in antiquity there were Roman masts that stood atop the masonry structure, and from which tented awnings were hung to shelter the crowd from the rays of the sun, and to stiffen the cornice to receive that stress and strain. This bracketed form was a way of stiffening up the top of the structure. In Sebastian Serlio, in the mid-16th century, published the first treatise on classical orders of the early Renaissance, and I show you a plate from his treatise at the bottom, where it shows a design for a Doric door case, where he takes the idea of the cyma reversa bracket and infuses it with the triglyphs of a Doric order to create this idiosyncratic form, which is rooted in the particular detail from antiquity. Later on, you can see on the top half of the slide, this is the crowning cornice from the Palazzo Farnese at Caprarola by Vignola, where he takes a similar detail of scroll bracket and adds another modillion bracket on top of it there. So again, adapts it and makes it his own. And then later on, again, on the bottom of the slide is Bernini's cornice for Palazzo Odescalchi, where he takes the scroll bracket and adapts it and makes it his own again, but still rooted in this antique precedent from antique sources within their own city. And then the slide I show you here are the 2 buildings known as Palazzi della Sidra, which are two curved buildings that sit on the line of the old Exedra from the Baths of Diocletian, and they became a sort of triumphant entrance into the older city from the new railway station. And you can see those two similarly use details from the books I've just shown you. On the larger detail on the right-hand side, you can see the Doric order over the arch on the end bay uses scroll triglyph brackets to articulate the cornice over that central arch. At the same time, in the 19th century, Italy began to develop its own heavy industry to support its railways and other uses of cast iron. And so it's interesting, there's another theme to this, how people were thinking about how the antiquity could help them deal with new building materials and new forms of building. And in, when was it, 1880, sort of 1860s, 1870s, an architect-archaeologist, Luigi Canina, published a book, which I show you a plate from on the left-hand side here, the title of which is Thin Forms in Domestic Architecture, for the English translation, Svelte Forme in Architettura Domestica in Italian. And in this book, he published plates of what are known as second and fourth style Pompeian wall paintings, and offered them as an example of how you might articulate cast iron, so very thin columns, to embellish them in a way which is appropriate for classical design. Now, in antiquity, the second and fourth style paintings were used to create a sense of false perspective in atria and other Roman buildings. This one, as I say, particularly comes from the Baths of Titus on the Esquiline in Rome. But he was offering these designs up as a way of inspiring how people might use these drawings from antiquity or paintings from antiquity to embellish cast iron as a useful building material. On the right-hand side is a building from the 1880s by a man called Ettore Bernig, an aquarium, one of the first new buildings of public instruction, if you like, to help the public to understand a bit more about the natural world. It was an aquarium built with cast iron, one of the first cast iron buildings in the city of that time. And you can see, looking at the columns, they take direct inspiration from the wall paintings in the Baths of Titus. If you look carefully, you can also see that the brackets underneath the balcony are more rostrum brackets, more ship's prows. And if you look very carefully, you can see that the coat of arms in the middle is the coat of arms of the House of Savoy, which was the royal family, which were the first kings of Italy. So there's a lot of political motive note going into the design as well. Coming back from Italy in the early 1990s, before that, actually, at the time I was Rome Scholar, I won a place on the first summer school, which the Prince of Wales ran for architects in 1990, which was partly in Oxford and partly in Italy. And then on the second summer school the following year, when I was living in Rome, I helped teach that summer school. And then coming back to London, I was invited to become the senior tutor on the new foundation course, which we set up and ran within the Prince of Wales Institute of Architecture. And the slide you can see here is a younger version of myself teaching a student to measure the tissue cast wrought iron balustrading on the Dean's Staircase in St Paul's Cathedral. Another exercise we did then was working with practitioners. This one was with the late Dick Reed, the great master craftsman, where we would look at botanical plant forms, looking for their form, but also the geometry and repetition that occurs in nature. There's a sketch here from a morning spent in a botanical garden. And then with charcoal, learning how to make them into cartoons to sort of create compositions. And then beyond that, taking them into stone. This was an example of the students' first ever stone carving of a swag based on what they'd learned at the hands of one of these master craftsmen who taught with us on that course. And frankly, during that time, I gave myself the education I never had as a student. It was a really fantastic experience. Each year too, we would do a live build project where we'd work with a real client with the students, and we would take a brief and then produce a design, working drawings, and then work as a team to construct the building. In this particular example, it was a green oak shed in a garden in Surrey, where there's not one piece of metal in the construction. It was all made out of peg joints in a traditional way, and a great experience for everyone to see how you could make things without using a huge amount of modern technology. Another example here was a building built on a lakeside in West London with the architect John Simpson, which was also an investigation into the origins of or possible origins of the Doric order. And you can see on the left-hand side here a plate from Robert Adams' book, The Classical Architecture Handbook, showing a very nice drawing to show the hypothesis that the embellishment of the Doric order has origins with timber construction. Throughout these years as an academic, the Prince would take a very profound interest in his students and would come regularly to come and meet them and to talk to them about the work that they were doing. And that was a great inspiration for everyone. And I think he found it fascinating too. And then in 2003, having run the foundation course for a while, I was invited to become the Duchy of Cornwall's architect, which is, again, a position I've managed to hold until to this day, working sometimes with Leon Krier and other architects who I'm sure you'll be familiar with, and I'll come back to that a bit later on. So moving now to the second part of the talk, this is an early project of mine, a golf club building in Hertfordshire, not far from Homewood, the house for Lutyens' in-laws, and you can see it's an exploration really of the idea of a vernacular building form embellished with classical details. And there's another shot of the Venetian window at the big rooms at the end. Quite a lot of the work I do is working with classical and traditional buildings, and because of this sort of feeling that we can't help but express ourselves, we don't have to worry about being self-conscious when it comes to style. It was a theme that a late architect, Roderick Grady's, used to call keeping in keeping. You could argue that was the way we approached the restoration of this house, Chettle House in Dorset, by the early Baroque architect Thomas Archer. This building was sold when it was virtually derelict, and we managed to piece it together again from 7 apartments into one, and to really put back all the lost detail, but in a way which was very unself-conscious. So hopefully you wouldn't know we'd been there. It just all felt right and reasonable, but at the same time adapting it to modern patterns of living. So here's the floor plan. You can see very unusual, and Thomas Archer was known for these rounded corners. On the left-hand side of the slide, 19th century drawing room that was made after Archer's time. And on the right-hand side, in the bottom right corner, we managed to get consent to take out one of the original pieces of wall to make a modern family kitchen on the main floor of the house, which in itself is quite controversial, but as part of a comprehensive plan to put it back into good order. And it was an area of wall which had been interrupted and fiddled with several times before. It was deemed this was a reasonable recompense for the investment that was being made by our client. On the eastern side of the house, we put this new reflecting pool, which brings light into the house in the morning and also makes a very dramatic Baroque setting for it, rather as you might see at Easton Neston. And inside, we took much of the structure to bit, including this wonderful staircase, and repaired it in the traditional way. So it's now safe again, which it definitely wasn't safe before. And in the cellar, there was a false floor 2 feet up from the original floor, and whole structure being subdivided, and it was absolutely wringing wet. It was in a shocking state. And the drawing room I showed you on the earlier plan had no architectural detail at all. And so working with Ben Pentreath, we conceived this idea of Belection mouldings on the wall. So hopefully you won't know we've been there, but it creates a room which feels authentic and in harmony with the character of Archer's earlier work. And I guess you might argue uses our academic knowledge of classical architecture in an appropriate way to complete a design that was never finished before. The building had been shorn of all its outbuildings, so we had fun designing a new cart shed and other barns to go with it. And then a little pool house as well, where we felt, because Dorset's very much an area of flint, it would be fun to make the central bay out of cubed flint, something that Stone did once or twice, and you can see detail of that on the left-hand side here. So a footnote, we're back at the moment at that site, replacing the house I show you on the screen here with a new design meant to look like the stable block that might have been there with the house before, as a pair of rental cottages. Another project, this one in Hampshire, not so far from our main office, a remodel and significantly extended house. This, in fact, is almost an entirely new wing. One small piece at the right-hand end existed with different fenestration. This makes quite a nice south-facing main elevation with big windows. And then the two halves of the house were united by this cantilever stone staircase with simple classical detailing internally. A project in the north of England, a not particularly inspired sort of cottage ornate house built in the woods in Yorkshire, which we remodeled and extended in a cottage ornate gingerbread house style. And then a more recent one, a wonderful site with a terrible house on the cliff tops in the Channel Islands. This was the house we took down and replaced it with a Palladian villa, as you can see here, made of stone on a granite base. And each time with these projects, we're using our knowledge of traditional design, traditional materials, and a passion for craftsmanship to do things in a beautiful and hopefully timeless or relatively timeless way. Just we're not being self-conscious about being different. We're just doing the right thing to make the building work and to feel complete. Another project with my Duchy of Cornwall hat on is the Oval Cricket Club in South London. When we arrived there, this was the situation. The blue building was a pub full of asbestos and uninhabitable. When it was taken down, this was the back of the pavilion that we found. It had been extended vertically twice by previous architects, but with no thought to how it might look if the pub was not there. And so we were asked to put a new front on the building to make it feel more harmonious. So hence the arrival of this portico, where if you look carefully, you can see we've taken the Corinthian order and used ostrich feather capitals, which is the Surrey Cricket Club badge, but also the Duchy of Cornwall badge. And then the first Ashes match between Australia and Britain was played here, not at Lord's, the other cricket club in London. So we have Ashes urns atop as well. Just to remind everyone, that's where the Ashes started. And here's a detail of the Corinthian capitals, which we worked on with a craftsman called Carl Dury, using computerized carving with his hand-produced clay models that were scanned and used as the base for it. As part of the work at the Oval, there was a prescription from the English Cricket Board to increase the seating capacity from 25,000 to 35,000 seats. And at that time, the club very much turned its back on the surrounding area, and there were issues of prostitution and drug abuse and so on in the surrounding streets. And so there was, I think, thought of how we could make this into a virtuous circle by effectively creating a modern coliseum, building out to the edge of the site, creating activity along the street to improve the safeness and natural policing of that, and then corbelling back the seating on the inside to create this extra seating capacity. And this could then be realised in phases. So the slide I show you here was the original stage. There we are with the portico we put on. Here we are with the first building on the right-hand side of the pavilion. And here we are in time with the next building on the left-hand side to create that sense of a modern coliseum. And then this is the actual building that Rolf Judd Architects produced working with me on the project. Not quite as we designed, but still in a sort of very spare, almost Art Deco form, which I think is quite appropriate to sort of harmonise with the character of the building at the other side of the street. And work will begin shortly on phase 2. A more recent project at Trinity College in Oxford. I show you the site plan here. Trinity is an unusual college. The square in the middle of the screen is known as Durham Quad. It was originally a medieval monastic community. And it's unusual because it has significant gardens that face out onto the street and are not tucked away. So the buildings are in the middle of the site with gardens out to the street. That's the sort of the form of it. This is a slide of what's the building, the quad to the north of the Durham Quad, which was designed by Christopher Wren, with another floor added later on, so very restrained with a few Baroque flourishes. And the site we had for a big mixed-use building, I show you the diagram for just here, an area of the gardens which had a lot of trees in it. And in the investigations to what might be possible, there were 2 trees shown in pink, which were trees from a 17th century planting scheme, 2 lime trees, which originally formed part of an avenue. And then there was an overgrown yew hedge shown in yellow. And then we looked at the circulation routes to connect with the other buildings of different ages, which you can see with a dotted line. And it was decided after an extensive consultation that the building should take the form I show you here, which effectively is a series of buildings which address different parts of the garden and extend to enclose the quad you can see in the middle of the slide, which means that the new range of buildings one wing of it will face south onto that quad to bring life and activity to what was previously rather a desolate space, which looked something like that. And the building on the right-hand side of the screen is one that we took down. The concept for this building, because of its scale, is it should be divided into a number of smaller buildings, so that none of them in their own dwarf the older, smaller buildings around them. And you can see that there are 4 conceptual buildings coloured up in the way on the screen you see just now. Here is the ground floor plan, quite a difficult plan to make work in some ways. The main block on the left-hand side with an entrance foyer with a community space or cafe on the left-hand side of the entrance, and on the right-hand side, a multi-purpose auditorium, and behind that, linking onto the library building, an extension of the library with a librarian's office and then study space above. And then the wing that sticks out into the garden, and the rooms on the right-hand end are teaching rooms to improve the facilities of the college from an academic point of view. Each face of the building has different design and different materials to give that sense of changeableness so it doesn't become dominating in its character. At its eastern end, the walls are finished in Cotswold stone to harmonise with Gilbert Scott's new Bodleian building to the side of it. Here's a shot of the main block in Bath, ashlar stone, looking onto an area known as the Wilderness with those 2 lime trees which survived from the earlier planting scheme. And then the connection back to the earliest 20th century World War I Memorial Library, where we took down that ugly 60s building to make a new classical building as a politer neighbour. And the doors on the left are the ones that face south for the cafe, which can then mean that in summer the students can spill out onto that terrace and enjoy the sunshine. And here's a view of the auditorium, which goes down into the ground. And it has a variable acoustic where the panels on the wall can rotate to create a harder or softer acoustic, depending on the activity taking place there. So moving on to our last few slides now, this is, I mentioned since 2003, we've been architect and master planner to the Duchy of Cornwall. This was a poster that we produced quite early on of the sort of idealised view of what we were trying to do at Nansleddon in Newquay. It was to create a town which was distinctively Cornish in its character, led by sustainability and the encouragement of the council. We were asked to look ahead 50 years to think how we could respond to the needs of the town in an appropriate way. In Britain, of course, there's a very strong tradition of landowners controlling development well before the Town and Country Planning Act. I'll show you here the city of Bath, the master plan, where the landform is controlled by the landowner, and then individual plots here were sold off, and you could do what you like behind the main elevation as long as you built your main part of the elevation. So on the top, on the right-hand side, is the Royal Circus in Bath, Royal Crescent in Bath, rather, forgive me. And on the back, the bottom right-hand side is the back of the same run of buildings. So you can see behind the polite public elevation is pretty much a free-for-all. And the approach we take with these urbanism projects, we work in concert with house builders using their standard plan, i.e. like the backs of this 18th century crescent, but it's the public realm elevations, the front elevation that we control to give us the ability to control the character of a street. So this is very much the approach we used at Nansleddon, with urban blocks typically between 40 and 60 metres, a very traditional sort of urban block pattern distorted to accommodate the contour. And in contrast with Poundbury, where the main road goes around the edge of the development, we wanted the heat of activity by roads going through the middle of it to create the bustle of a new market street as the new sub-town centre. So where the big red line divides in the middle of the image, that's the junction where the main street divides and one half goes west, one half goes east. And that's where our market street is placed, not only to form the commercial heart of Nansleddon, but also to improve the lives of people in the 20th century suburban crust of the existing town. Nansleddon will take probably 40 years to complete. I'll be jolly old when it's finished if I'm still here. We build about 100 houses a year, and we work in concert in phases with local or regional house builders. And the whole thing is about a collaboration between the developer group, the house builders, and the vision of the landowner, which I think is quite an important tension. And it's delivered through the master plan and then local street codes that will make sure you can tell when you're on a street what kind of street it is, whether it's a main street or secondary or tertiary. We have network analysis software, Place Logic. You can Google it and find out more about it, which produces a heat map. And when we were looking at our local centres and sub-centres, we were able to prove through this software that they were on natural hotspots on the network. And therefore, it's a place where non-residential users will do well because they're naturally busy junctions on it. An aerial shot some years ago now, but you can see there's a clear street hierarchy evident from on the ground with the main street with bigger setbacks, bigger pavements, grander architecture, bigger gardens, a whole range of clues to help you orientate yourself with quite big houses. And then you quite quickly go back to secondary and tertiary streets with more humble architecture beyond. As of today, we built about 800 homes. 30% of them are affordable. On this plan, you can see where the affordable houses are. They're 10-year blind and sprinkled throughout the development, which is a very successful way of integrating affordable homes into the scheme without affecting the values elsewhere. So the remit was to reflect local character with exemplary materials, but also to be exemplary in terms of sustainability. And we realized quite early on, if you take away cheap fossil fuel, that vernacular architecture is intrinsically quite sustainable. And that's quite a good place to start. And furthermore, if you can use local materials, we know they work well in quite a harsh maritime climate. And if you can make it work economically, you can put that money back into the local economy, which creates local jobs, an opportunity for younger people as well. And because the buildings, the materials are local, they have a low carbon footprint too. The building I show you here was a site called Tregunwell Hill, which we built first 180 homes, which gave us a way of testing the ability to use local materials in a commercial way. Another shot of a tertiary lane here, again, just with very, very simple architecture, much simpler than at Poundbury, using strong colour and spare use of local materials to make it affordable to create that sense of local identity. There's also a whole planting strategy with a strong emphasis on edible plants too, which you can see with some of the plants visible on the screen here. And then a typical secondary street with slightly simpler architecture, and then townhouses, which are quite simple in their architecture, but using painted brick, another cheap material, which gives quite a strong character. And again, this is not the character used everywhere, but in particular places, just a few buildings like this really add value to the whole scheme. Another secondary street, and again, you can see the architecture is more subdued, the gardens are more modest, the boundary treatment is more modest, the door surrounds are more modest, and so on. So everything works together to give you a sense of place and the hierarchy, and then a tertiary lane. And it may well be that the house type behind the elevation is the same plan form as one of the buildings on one of the other streets, but the way you elevate it makes it feel distinctive and reinforces that placemaking hierarchy. And again, another shot of some houses, just showing how simple they can be with bright colours and a few use of local materials to give you that sense of local character. We invest quite a lot of time and effort into the community to make sure that the people form themselves into that cohesive group. There's a community association which now organises events and throughout the years. There's their summer fete from a couple of years ago, and we're also in parallel with pushing on the sustainability side to drive down the embodied carbon. So the homes you see here already exceed the embodied carbon target for the RIBA and for LETI for 2030, and we're moving towards zero carbon, but we're still some way from that. But we aim to minimise carbon through good design and construction with good air tightness, and to meet the residual demand as efficiently as possible for operational carbon. So there's some houses on the front looking very traditional, and on the back where you don't see them, we use quite a lot of photovoltaic panels to make the buildings as self-sufficient as possible. And the extra cost of Cornish slate on the roofs of the houses is offset by the use of corrugated iron on the lower garages at the back. Now, with any scheme, and it's never really talked about, hugely important to include workspace. It's not just about nice looking houses. You have to include workspace so you can live a low carbon lifestyle. This is an example of one of the 40 mixed use buildings we've delivered already, with, in this case, a yoga cafe on the ground floor and flats above in a vernacular style, a bit like a converted market hall. And then here in an Art Deco style, which in our mind was part of the seaside vernacular. And again, it's got commercial on the ground floor and flats above. And then a couple of years ago, we finished this work hub complex. The building on the left is a work hub for people working from home to come and have meetings in small clusters with a cafe on the ground floor. The building in the middle is a nursery school, and the building on the right is a community centre and office building, which is just off the main high street. But it's an early way of delivering some activity to a scheme of this size. And we built the first new primary school in Cornwall for 30 years. This one is a building on 2 floors. Most new schools are on one single story. And the fact it's on 2 stories makes it much more efficient to build, so you can build to a much higher specification. This one was designed by Francis Roberts, who very sadly died a couple of weeks ago. And this is a shot of the high street from some time ago, actually, to show the character. You can see it's a much wider street than many of the others there. And if you look very carefully, you can see that the pavement's continuous height, so that the traffic has to go up and over the pavement to go from the side street to the main street and vice versa, to help prioritise pedestrians and cyclists over cars. And here's a view of part of the high street where you can see there are commercial buildings again on the ground floor with flats above and another Art Deco building in the background. And here's an early visualization of what will become the Market Street, which will start on site later this year as the new commercial heart of the whole extension to Newquay at Nansleddon. We're doing similar things with other landowners across the country. This one's with Blenheim Palace Estate in Woodstock in Oxfordshire, a small market town which has 2 beautiful market squares. And originally it had a number of hamlets on its periphery, which over time the town has grown out to absorb. This site had a checkered planning history, and rather than just designing a housing estate, we thought it was so much better to design the extension as if it was another new hamlet on the edge of the town. And so in plan form, there's the road that connects to the network on both sides of the scheme. And in the middle, there's another new square with commercial buildings ranged around it. And then the road that goes off to the east will allow for a future extension if it's required in due course. The buildings being built, you can see, are very simple buildings, but using materials typical of Oxfordshire, with stone walls and brick and lime render, and then slate and clay tile, and just really not going mad on the architectural detail, but with just good quality materials that give you that sense of place, again, using standardized house builder plans. And pre-pandemic, but even more so post-pandemic, with more people working from home, we find that these coach houses with office space above garages are really popular and sell for a significant premium. And that seems to be happening on most of these schemes we're working on across the country now. On this scheme, 50% of the houses are affordable, but again, they're all tenure blind and spread throughout the scheme, so you can't tell where they are. But the open market houses still sell for a significant premium because it's a nicer place to live overall. And you can see that the local materials are only used on some of the buildings, but they give a very strong sense of identity and sense of place. And then here's the new central square, which is under construction at the moment. So, in conclusion, what is the value of tradition, which is the title of the talk? And I hope through this last hour, I've teased out some strands of an answer to this question. I believe, as many others do on the call tonight, that tradition is a living thing which evolves over time, which can be adapted to meet new needs, be they functional, cultural, or technical. Knowledge of how tradition has evolved historically can help stimulate innovative ways of adapting it further to meet the challenges of new ages and new needs. And I guess the example of the cast iron architecture in Rome would be an example of that. But beyond that, tradition can help support local communities. So the use of local materials in these urban schemes puts money back into those communities, helps them with economic and social sustainability. It helps with identity. It gives buildings a root to their local context and their locality. It helps new buildings to sit alongside older buildings. If you do that approach, you can help to create local employment. And beyond that, you can help creating not only low carbon buildings, but most importantly, low carbon places. And when you do that properly, you help with health and well-being as well. And if we do all of that, in my mind, I would argue, it helps us to stand on the shoulders of previous generations of traditional architects and to put new buildings alongside old ones that sit comfortably together. Thank you very much indeed.
Well done, Hugh. Thank you so much. That was great. I must say that I really enjoyed that in the sense that you had this lovely way of giving your sort of life story and trajectory, with then a bit of show and tell at the end, because I suppose the show and tell can quite often sort of dominate presentations of this kind, and so you get a show and tell, and not much else. And it's just so good to have this us led there by this sort of story narrative and things like the particular very memorable passage of Letherby, and how that actually shows you very simply right back then, before the critiques of, say, people like Leon Creer and so on coming later, that the stylistic aspect of modernism was right there from the beginning. And so some of those questions that sort of set in your mind really early on, it's really lovely to see how all of that has developed to where you're going now. And then these are more comments than questions. I mean, we can, I think people in TAG can feel fairly relaxed about this. Sometimes you get comments from the audience, sometimes you get questions, and we can play with whatever comes along. But I think it's rather nice that we got Nanstetten near the end, but not quite at the end. But you in your normally how shall I say, a nice style, forgot to mention that, of course, at Nansleden this week, there was the King, the Prime Minister, and the Deputy Prime Minister. And so that we can just sort of hope for everyone else in the audience and beyond, and in the tag movement, and people interested in tradition, that they can pick up some of these clues and success stories and lessons for building in Britain more generally. So not really a question there, but
Yeah.
we can move over to any reflection you want to add, Hugh, would be great. But otherwise, we can move on to other people's questions.
Mark, thanks so much for your kind words. I think just to re-emphasize something you said, actually, which I tried to say also, that whenever I've worked in a different part of the country, I really enjoy the exercise of looking more carefully at the local architectural character before I do anything else, because you can always learn something from it. And the more you look, the more you see. And so with commercial schemes, where often the budgets are quite tight, if you understand what gives a particular area its local character, it kind of informs your whole approach to the design, and it kind of gives you a vocabulary to draw upon later on. And I think with some early schemes which were inspired by Panbury, everything was designed by an architect and everything was bespoke. And we add no value to most of that, because commercial houses are very well designed by house builders. They're very cheap to build and deliver what the market wants. But where we add value as designers is in the public realm, the sense of place. And I think spending the time just looking at what makes a place distinctive. And in Cornwall, it's not only the very poor palette of materials, actually, there's hardly any materials to build from there. So it makes the architecture very simple. But also, because you're on the Atlantic coast, the streets are very narrow as well, which gives it a very distinctive character to protect people from the Atlantic weather. But of course, narrow streets also regulate car speeds naturally too. So you can take lessons that you learned from your observation and think about how you can employ them creatively to deal with other issues. So you can then manage traffic speeds naturally without lots of ugly signs, just by the way you design that public realm too. So I think the more wherever you go, the more you look, the more you observe and see, and then you can start to think about how you can tune those lessons to help inform a design approach, which is also still commercial in the 21st century.
Absolutely, yes. No. I mean, that's what we all hope for. And I just wondered also with this visit recently to Nansleden, do you have a kind of sense of optimism that maybe in terms of the enormous number of houses that we are supposed to be able to build over the course of this government, whether some of it might get off in the right direction, as opposed to sort of normal traffic and vehicular and slabs and so on. Sorry, just over to you for your reflection on that.
Yeah, well, I was obviously very pleased that they ever made the effort. 'Cause it's quite a long way down to Cornwall to see it. It was the fact they'd made the effort wasn't a good sign. In the Times today, there was a piece saying the government, was impressed by it, and they want some of the new towns to draw inspiration from that sort of approach, which I've been articulating. And I think I do lobby government quite vigorously on this, that because of regulation that's come on since the 1948 Town and Country Planning Act, the cost of securing planning has got massively higher, and the delays go on for years and years and years. And so the speculative cost of going about it has just grown out of all proportion. And as a consequence, over 70% of development in Britain now happens with a handful of PLC house builders, and their whole commercial model is predicated on high volume, repetition, and low spending. So it doesn't produce the kind of places that we think are important. And so part of the answer to the challenge the government has set itself is they need to diversify the supply side and to encourage landowners to come back into the market. And I think their talk of deregulating planning is definitely helpful in that regard. I also think that by taking away risk, if they can do that, that will encourage more SME house builders back into the market. The buildings I've shown you are all designed by SME house builders. They're much lighter on their feet than the PLCs. And although the underlying house is generic, we choose typologies of house which are traditional. So that the double-fronted house with a door in the middle and window either side and so on is a very traditional plan for. In places like Cornwall, where the ground is quite steep, it's a very efficient way of putting a house along a road that runs along a contour where the ground falls away on one or both sides of it. So you can learn again from history and then use that in a commercial way, because it gives the whole thing a nice sort of symmetry to it. And in Cornwall, because we've shown by example we can do something better than planning can require, we now enjoy a special kind of planning permission called a local development order, which is a detailed consent within agreed parameters, which helps to take away risk and fees and delay for our clients. It also means if we're building out a phase and there are too many 5-bedroom houses, we can adjust the mix and build fewer of those and build more of houses which are more popular at the time. And if Apollodorus Architecture or someone else wanted to come and open an office in Cornwall, we could be on site building it for you within 3 months with no planning risk at all. Well, in an area,
I'll sign up. Yes.
well, I hope that might work. But it means that in deprived areas, taking away that planning risk becomes an attractor for inward investment too. And our master plan is for 50 years, so we've got lots of space for people like you and other people who may want to build an office there. And just when you've got that certainty of how a place will evolve over time and the planning risk is taken away, that becomes massively attractive. And now there, we effectively act as our own planning authority, so we keep our own records of what goes on, and it's audited by the local authority. And if we abuse it, that permission is taken away and we go back to the normal planning system. But if we obey with the parameters which we've agreed with the council, then they can spend their time as planning officers to regulate the bad schemes that need heavy handling elsewhere. So it's an entirely virtuous circle of enabling good developers to come forward with good schemes and giving the council resources more focus on the schemes that need heavy regulation.
No, that's a great model. So let's hope that can be done more often. But anyway, we should, you shouldn't keep quiet. You should be speaking more. I shall shut up and invite questions, which I think Georgia will moderate from now on. I unfortunately have to slip off.
Right. Mark, very nice to see you.
Very fantastic. So really great. Thank you, Hugh. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. It was a fantastic journey. Not only the educational part from the beginning, but then seeing how you develop so many types of projects, and now you are so involved even with the social part, not only the architecture and planning, everything which is so complex behind what we see. This is a thing that I do appreciate very much about your project, that what we see, it's just the top of the iceberg. Nobody sees the huge amount of thought and the work of a much more complex team, probably. I would like to ask now the audience if they have any questions.
Yes. Hugh.
Oh. Neil, how nice to see you. It's been a long time.
Neil Guy, it's a long time. The question was about solar panels. What is the view of using them on these developments? Are they necessary with these new houses? Can they be added later?
They can be added later, and with some of the schemes, we might do a roof plan of the development, which goes into a document which buyers sign up to when they buy a house, a covenant effectively, which shows in due course where you can go back and put solar panels without spoiling the public realm view. Because I think early on, certainly when we started building, we thought they weren't aesthetically good enough to go on the fronts of buildings. I think they are required because there's just not enough power in the grid to service everything at the moment from the main, the main sort of power stations and so on. So if you can de-stress the grid, particularly in remote places like Cornwall, but there's a big site not far from me in Hampshire, which is being held up for several years because there's not enough juice in the grid to service it. And therefore, whether you have a PV array in a field next door, which can go away later, whether you integrate it into the development, I think we've done a lot of work now looking at how you might integrate photovoltaic panels. And I think our feeling is if they're rectangular grids of panels rather than ones in odd shapes and so on, and if you counterbatten the slates either side, so the plane of the roof, the top face of the panel is the same height as the height of the tiles, slates either side. And if you choose a slate which tonally matches the color of the panel, then they almost disappear visually and they become sufficiently recessive that we think they are actually probably almost good enough to go on the fronts of buildings. Now, we have experimented too with lookalike photovoltaic slates, which do look actually very good now, some of them, because you can get dummy ones that fill up the whole plane of the roof, not just the bits where the slates, the PV slates are based. So I think it is a time of change. I'm not personally convinced what the longevity of photovoltaic panels are. Wherever you go around the country, if you see ones which are several years old, a lot of them don't look that great. I do worry a bit about that. But I think we do need to be bold about it and to think where we can use them. We can use them on garages and so on too, which are less prominent visually than the main roof of a house.
You showed an Art Deco building with a flat roof. Would it be possible to add them to a flat roof without any degree or need to change the colours of the panels?
That was one of the reasons why we were keen to explore Art Deco as a typology, as a style, actually, because we thought it would give us that opportunity. And just, it does exist. The trouble is that where these buildings are owned, it becomes a question of who owns the photovoltaic panels and what happens if something goes wrong. And so although we designed those buildings to take photovoltaic panels on the roof, the legal management of them became too complicated at the time we built them. It is sort of a possibility to go back and retrofit them later. And I'm not sure that's going to happen on the ones we've completed. But I guess, again, we're in a moment of change. And as these things become more widely used, I guess maybe there will be new legal structures and so on that should develop to help deal with these sorts of ownership and integration problems.
Thank you.
Other questions, please? Please unmute, Bob.
I couldn't
I
put my
unmute
hand up. Hugh, hello, very good.
Hello.
Quite interesting. You covered a little bit on it's not just planning these new areas, but what Adam Architecture are doing with pattern books, coding, and also place logic. I mean, these are important pieces of research, generally speaking, for urban design on a national basis. I know that Adam Architecture are working on these things, so I just give the opportunity to expand on that.
Thanks, Bob. Really, you were a pioneer in this back in the 1990s when you and I started working together. But I think we've developed quite efficient ways now with producing visual pattern books by having effectively an index that we can go and populate through photographic analysis of new places, and that with expanded captions as a way of capturing the character in a pattern book. Where once you've got that information, you can then use that in your codes as the second stage. A lot of codes are very complicated and are either too big or else they're too woolly. They're not prescriptive enough. And I think we are quite clear, as you are yourself, on how you need to keep codes as simple as you can, so they're easy to navigate, but also to be dogmatic about what you mean. So if you mean you can't do something, you need to say you can't do it rather than should not do it. It's you cannot do this. I am slightly skeptical about the power of codes in some context. I think within the planning atmosphere, codes can only be reasonable as anything else in planning can be. And so we quite often do what we call a placemaking code to go in with a planning application, which sets the principle of a hierarchy of street and local materials and so on. And then we might well do what you might call a state code, which is something much more prescriptive and dogmatic, which might then look into the realms of controlling the style of architecture, which sits outside of planning and is managed by the landowner as a separate set of gateways that you go through. So on some of the landowner projects, we have a kind of contract that Farrah's developed called a common aspiration contract, where the landowner sets a vision, which in turn informs the master plan and the code. We then would set a gateway before you go in for planning. That means you have to sign off the drawings through the landowner. And then at the second stage of sign off is with the working drawings, because they're often done by a different team. And what's conceived at the planning stage then can't be lost in the working drawings. And in some cases, we'll actually sign off the finished building as well, because quite often changes on a building site. And if there's no mechanism to go back and manage that change, often what comes out the other end isn't quite what was signed off at the earlier stage as well. There's no silver bullet to this. I think there are horses for courses, and I think there are perfectly good examples of codes. And you've done lots of work with the late Office for Place on that, and we're still carrying on that work ourselves. And I know you're actively involved in it too, and I'm sure other people on this call will be. And I think in some instances, then a code that's controlled by the local authority or the local authority in concert with the development team is fine. In other cases where there's a more dogmatic aspiration for the landowner, you might need to have a second code that sits outside of planning, which can be rather more prescriptive and dogmatic. But I think in each instance, there's such a huge amount you can learn from the locality where you're building. And quite often I see codes where people will make a reference to a vernacular detail, let's say a half-hip roof, and think that that's a vernacular detail, therefore that's okay. Now, as some of us on this call knows, half-hip roofs are quite common in Hampshire and in the sort of South Downs, but not very common in, let's say, Norfolk or somewhere else. So I think a visual acuity to look at what makes each area distinctive, going back to that point about geology at the start of the talk, and what materials are used and how they're used, means that when you're designing something in a different part of the country, you can really make it resonate with the particular character of that place.
Well, so Hugh, I give the opportunity to talk about place logic, because I think what you're doing on that is actually not only is helping, it's actually scientific, but it's also analytical. But I won't say any more. I'll leave you to say more about it, because I think important work's being done.
Thanks, Bob, again. And yeah, so you saw a plan on the Land project where one of the early outputs, which we've done for some time now, and again, you've been involved in that as well, produces the heat map of the desirability of routes over others, depending on how connected a street is. And it produces a very visual output that everyone can understand. And when we've been challenged in design review at why you put your local centre there, you can show, well, not only is that a 5 or 10 minute walk from where people live, but also that commercial use sits on a natural hotspot on the network. But just at the moment, we're doing some work with the Strathclyde University on looking at a new walkability tool, and also working with the Polytechnic of Milan in Italy as well. So Space Syntax and other network tools will look at the physical connectivity of a plan, and they'll look at where the non-residential attributes are, and will assess within a 20-minute neighborhood how many of those attributes you have the opportunity to walk to on foot, and you get a score from that. The tool we're developing does that, but as we all know, there can be other reasons, more emotional reasons, why you may or may not choose to take one route over another. If the ground is a very steep road, or if the buildings are 7 stories tall with no features like a sheer wall thing, with maybe no sun or a wind corridor, these could all be reasons why a street which on the plan looks perfectly nice, in reality is not a street you'd choose to walk down. And the Polytechnic of Milan has done a lot of research on people's emotional response to urban environments. And most of the information that we need is available on digital open sources as well. So the walkability tool that Place Logic is developing synthesizes the physical connectivity and desirability of a network with these other more emotional attributes to create a much more sophisticated measure of true walkability. And I think we feel as a practice that the government obsesses about zero carbon buildings, which we're all saying of course are important. But you can live in a zero carbon house. If you have to use your car to drive everywhere, you've only answered half the exam question. And actually, that's the easy half to answer, because buildings come and go over time, or they can be improved, as Neil's question was alluding to earlier on. Once you lay out a place with streets and so on, it's almost impossible to reassemble the land again. And therefore, making a place where you can live a low carbon lifestyle actually matters much more. And of course, if people do walk in their community, they will bump into people, so their sense of health and well-being is probably enhanced too. So for all kinds of reasons, we think walkability is And of course, the government set up the new whatever it's called, the new office to look at walkability on bigger schemes nationally. But we just think that this new digital tool, which now sits on the government's digital planning portal, can be a real help for those of us involved in this kind of work to make sure that places we design are properly walkable.
I would like to ask you if you consider teaching all those or publishing them so they become a tool for other architects to continue the system.
I mean, the ambition, it is already a tool that's available commercially. Anyone can use it. So we're now acting as a consultancy service for Place Logic to other architects and landowners. And over time, it will be hived off as a separate company to make it completely separate from Adam Architecture. But already it's being used by other development teams. And we have no ambition to supplant them as designers. We're just offering it as a paid service to help them improve the quality of their design. And we're talking to some local authorities who want to use it as part of their local plan review. So when you're looking at where sites might come forward for development, you can look at where you put development, not only to make a new community, which is more walkable by defining what attributes need to go in it. If there's an existing community where there are attributes missing, you can then identify those and with a development brief, make sure they're included in the new development too, so that the new development can improve the walkability of the existing town as well as the new area too. So I think we're in a time of strategic thinking again. There was a time when that was much more common in planning, because plannings or buildings become so unpopular development that everyone's kind of retreated, just allowing the minimum each time. But if we're serious about solving the whole environmental problem and making better places, we have to become much more strategic again. And we think Place Logic and tools like that can be very helpful in encouraging that more high-minded and strategic level of thought.
Thank you very much. And I was also wondering if you work with the existing heritage appraisal of the areas when you design, because I'm sure that some councils have developed some guides of the local features of the traditional architecture. You don't have to invent everything from scratches. Are you cooperating with the heritage bodies?
No, we are. Yeah, we have our own in-house historians as well. And as you will have gathered, I have a very academic interest in architectural tradition as well as my professional experience. And so, we love collaboration, whether it's with students or local authorities or bigger teams, other architects. I think, the great strength of doing these schemes better is learning to work together more effectively. The pattern book we did for Newquay back in 2003 has now been adopted by Newquay Town Council and is used to guide development all over the rest of the town as well. They didn't pay us anything for that, but we're delighted they should have it because it obviously is a benefit for the wider community too. And we've got other examples of pattern books in other parts of the country where, once we've been paid for it, we don't mind who uses it if it has a wider benefit. I think it's all about working collaboratively and sharing skills. You can always learn things from each other and just being a bit more sort of integrated in your approach.
That's very true. Other questions?
Good evening, Hugh. I live here in Cornwall, and I was just wondering if you had any more Cornish projects in the pipeline.
Ollie, good evening. Nice to see you. I have one potential site which I'm waiting to hear back from at the moment, actually, which I'm very excited about and hope it comes in. I have also done a new zero carbon manor house in Cornwall some years ago. It was the site of a doomsday manor, and it had a terrible planning history with 2, if not 3, previous designs all thrown out on appeal by the inspector. And in that instance, the way we went about it, going back to this idea of pattern books, with my in-house historian colleague, it was on the site of a manor house. So we did a gazetteer survey of all the manors in Cornwall, and most of them are an E-shaped plan form. And so by looking at the typology of Cornish manor houses, we started to construct an argument. This is the site for a manor house that has been demolished. Therefore, it's reasonable to allow a manor house to go back there. And if it is, then it should be of this form, because that's the local typology of a manor house in that part of the country. And so that was sort of created the stylistic rationale for it. And then our client, who was a financier, was passionate about sustainability and owned other barns and stuff. And through a combination of measures, both on the building and with the other attributes on the land, working with David Strong, who was the ex-managing director of the Building Research Establishment, we did get to a position where, in his mind, it was the first truly zero carbon new house in the country at the time we did it, which was very exciting for us. But it's made of Cornish granite with Cornish slate on the roof, so you have no idea looking at it of its sustainability credentials. And it doesn't have to be an expression of modernity or sustainability to have that level. If you want to, of course you can, but it's also possible with a traditional approach to achieve things which are pretty exemplary.
On this note of autobiographical journey, we have a question from Asaya. Asaya, would you like to unmute your microphone and ask directly, or you prefer me to read it? So he's asking what you recommend for getting a traditional architecture education and growing knowledge in contemporary traditional architecture and urbanism. So what's the route? What can a student do?
That's a great question. There's probably not a simple answer to it, but I think for those of you who are students now, my sense is that it's a much more integrated community than it was when I was a student. The style wars seem to have receded. There are a lot more practitioners out there who are interested in it. And so if you're lucky, you'll go to a school of architecture where it's taught or at least tolerated, so you can pursue your own interest. There are a lot of great short courses out there now. Robert one's one in Oxford. There's the Intbau Summer School. There's the Cambridge Centre of Summer School as well. There are Intbau Summer Schools all over Europe. So it's quite possible to dip your toe into those waters in the vacation times. And in my time, I won a place, as you heard, on that first Prince of Wales Summer School. Until that point, I thought I was the only student in the world who had the sort of issues or thoughts that I had. And suddenly I was in a community of 30 people with similar interests. And it was just a real life-changing moment for me. And I teach on some of these summer schools myself because I think they're just so important to give people who've got the interests that you have an opportunity to acquire that knowledge and kind of just understand a new way of thinking or looking at the world. There's a Create Streets to an excellent summer school too, which I was involved with last year, which looks at both urbanism and architecture. I think also with the internet, so many books that were quite rare when I was a student are now available as digital downloads as well. And I think by the kind of community you've got here at TAG, there's a way of sharing knowledge about where you can get information. And I think certainly I always make time to talk to students. I know many other of the practitioners on this call are very generous with their time as well. And I think, we're all keen to encourage the next generation as well. I'm very keen on particularly for a part 2 of an architect's training, to go and do a part-time course or even an apprenticeship. There's one at Cambridge at the moment. We've got about 20 students in our office. 2 of them are apprentices at Cambridge, where they're based in our office, but go to Cambridge for short, intensive periods. Reading are looking to set up an apprenticeship course as well. And with those sorts of courses, firms like ours will actually pay the students' fees to do the part-time or the apprenticeship course. So you come out at the end of it with probably 3 or 4 more years of practical experience and no student debt, because you've earned your own living by working with a practice during the same time. So I think there are summer schools, part-time course options, and then communities like TAG, where we can all come together and share the knowledge that we've acquired over years and help to foster that sense of togetherness and move things on again.
Thank you so much. I think Nadia Everard has a question, but she didn't write it yet. And I was thinking, what's your opinion about a mentorship program? Our colleague Edward would like to launch something like that to match practically students and more experienced architects, can guide them.
Yes, I guess it's all about time, really. And I think it's a lovely idea. And I guess, at one level, you can have informal meetings from time to time with people. But for that more active mentorship, I think this idea of either studying part-time or doing it on an apprenticeship option, if you can do that, gives you much more exposure to the more experienced practitioners. And it gets you involved in the whole ethos of an office and a practice and learning. You'll learn so much more from being part of their projects than just looking at a book or having an occasional conversation. So I think immersing oneself in working with firms with similar interests is probably the best way of gaining that knowledge.
Yes, the learning curve is much steeper. Toby Lick has a question. If you would like to unmute your microphone, Toby, and ask.
Good evening, Hugh, and thank you very much. I did have a quick question. Now, forgive me, I'm an estate agent in Southwest London, but I do have a huge passion for property and certainly the architecture that you do. I was up in Liverpool this afternoon at a conference and looking at some of the sort of beautiful buildings there. I sort of struggle in my industry why people, certainly the new builds, just don't do more of what you do. How are we going to get that crossover? What can we do to make more people do what you do in making buildings sustainable and gorgeous and pretty, and where people want to actually live and go and purchase and live and have a lovely community?
A great question, Toby. I'll try and give you a good answer to it. I think if you look at a lot of new buildings, they actually are designed in a vaguely traditional way by developers, but they don't have the academic knowledge that we have as traditional practitioners. And I guess part of the ambition of the summer schools and the other educational options we've got now is to try and help the next generation that are coming up through the ranks, like Ollie and his colleagues, to get that better education. So that when you're designing a classical building, it's a literate classical building rather than an approximation of a classical building. And I think it's a great skill for an architect too, that working with a high-end client, once you've got those skills, they've got the money in the budget, you can really do amazing things with it. It's much, much more difficult with a commercial client, and some of the people you deal with are not very sensitive to the finer points of aesthetic detail too. And you have, a lot of architects get very precious at that point, and then they become unpopular and they just get stood down. And I think you have to learn over time what you can compromise on and what you really is a red line. And I think the kind of relationship where you've got a landowner involved, where the landowner has more control, where you get these additional gateways beyond normal planning and building regulations, that's a way of kind of making sure that what gets built new is a lot better. I mean, I think the scheme in Woodstock is a scheme with slightly higher architecture than the scheme in Nansledden, for example. But because we've had that ongoing control of the house builders, the quality of stonework is really quite good there, and the quality of the joinery and so on again is good. But it's like all these projects, they're a journey. They'll make mistakes on day one, and almost invariably initially, you walk around and say, look, that's not what we drew or what you drew. It's not right, and you can leave it there this time, but the next time you do it, you want it done properly, or make you take it down. And it's just about sort of hearts and minds and holding hands and working as a team, really. And that can be a 360 process too. So that those painted yellow brick townhouses I showed towards the end in Nansledden, they were very, very difficult for the house builder to build because they had a lot of different trades working in sequence upon them on a sloping site. And it costed the house builder a huge amount of money to build them. So we all agree at the end of it, these look great, but they're too expensive to build. So next time, if you use that design, don't do it on a sloping site. And so I think, no one should ever think they know all the answers to all the questions, because we never, ever do. And I think, you will learn over time. We all will make mistakes. But if we can get a bit more generous with our knowledge as we've acquired it, and also listen to other people's issues and just get better at working together, that will help to spread the knowledge that we're all interested in and learning from each other to try and overcome some of the challenges that otherwise exist. One thing I am doing is with Haddonstone, a bit of soft PR. Most cast stone details you get now for classical ornament are illiterate. They don't understand the principles of classical composition. So the proportions of the columns are wrong. Most cornices are divided into 3 or 5 parts with convex and concave mouldings running sequentially through it. The people who draw those things have no knowledge of any of that. So the whole thing's just an approximation and looks pretty horrible. We've designed a range of new Haddonstone porches based on the orders of James Gibbs. And I used Gibbs because of his significance in terms of the English vernacular tradition. And now for the same price as any other cast stone porch, you can buy a Gibbs porch, be used either on your listed building or on a commercial house. And you pay the same price, and each time it's sold, I get a small, or the office gets a small commission too. And I think, in the 18th century, there were lots of standardized traditional building components. And I think there's definitely scope for more of us to do more of these, whether it's a nice window or a goodies, cornice or something, to make more of these catalog components available to help people who've got the ambition but don't know where to go and buy the right stuff, to make it more freely available.
Thank you.
So practically less ego, more community spirit. That would be the...
Yeah, we have our hard and artery moments too, but we try and, where we can, work with people.
Any other question for the public, or we will wrap this session of questions?
I have one further question here.
Okay.
Neil, it's I have a copy of your superb book, Living Tradition.
Ah, yes. But I forgot to show my last slide showing the cover. It's available for more good book sales, but
which I'm enjoying very much. In regard to your Stocks Golf Club, you show a lovely picture of a window, and it's the caption to the window is a Diocletian window. That's what it says.
yes,
Is that correct?
it is. So it's a half round window with vertical divisions in it. And it's a kind of window that was seen in Roman bath buildings. And if you go to the baths of Diocletian in Rome, you'll find examples of them there. Sometimes they're referred to as thermal windows too. But one of the words is a Diocletian window because of the fact they were used on that. And I think also on Diocletian's palace at Split as well. So
I thought the Diocletian window had a round going right round to the edges of the verticals. Anyway, I thought that was a Surliana, but
the Surliana is the Venetian window. So the other window at Stocks Golf Club with an arched heady window in the middle, and the am I talking nonsense? I think you're quite right. The Surliana is another description for it as well. There's more. I probably ought to refer you to Robert Adams' book, actually, Classical Language, which gives you a very good sort of synopsis of these terms.
I have it, and I will look at it again. Thank you.
Yeah. Sorry about the crosswire there. I saw also that David Barrow was on the call tonight, who's the managing director of Haddonstone, who's an absolutely top man, and it's been really very enjoyable working with him and his colleagues and trying to understand how cast stone works as a material, what you can and can't do with it, how to make the classical moldings work with moldings and so on, with molding profiles and so on. There's an absolute wealth of knowledge there. And another theme which I sort of touched on earlier on is this. It goes back to the question I think someone asked about how to acquire this stuff. Going to talk to specialists, tradesmen and craftsmen, and looking at and understanding the materials and what they can and can't do, how you work with them and so on. I found through when I was running that foundation course in London in the 1990s, I gave myself the education I never had when I was a student. And like the exercise I showed with the stylization of natural plant forms into ornament, just taking time to go and speak to a stone carver or wood carver, or going to see a fibrous plaster shop and understanding the stages of design that they go through is massively educational. I don't know whether TAC do any arranged trips to those sorts of places, but firms like Stevenson's of Norwich or Haddonstone are fantastic days out for people who are interested in that kind of thing, and just so educational.
Yes, we did, and we will have again a Locker and Riley tour, and we planned last year a Keton Stone, but it was a rail suspension, so we couldn't go there. And also TAG organized in cooperation with Imbau, Belgium, with La Table Ronde, we did a 2 days workshop on traditional plaster with Philip Gash, and that was extremely interesting.
I saw the photographs. It looked fantastic.
Yes, it was fantastic. It was really cold, but how much we learned there was fantastic. And I also, being a SPAB guardian, I might recommend working parties during the summer. You can work with flint, with brick, with all those materials. You can have the direct experience of materials. This is very important. And also the summer schools. Some of the summer schools have this component of hands-on workshop. And maybe that's a very good way to wrap up this talk, announcing that on the 18th of February, we will have a great celebration of summer schools. And after we present 15 existing, running, and new summer schools all around Europe, and not only, also South America, North America, Australia, we will also present a few selection of hands-on workshop. So we consider very much that this is part of the education that an architect has to have. So you can't really separate the building tradition from designing architecture. You are not truly an architect if you don't understand materials. And I think your talk was practically a perfect demonstration of this, that you have to understand, and not only the materials, but also the social part, the management part, the planning, everything. Architecture, it's such a complex discipline after all. So if there aren't any other questions, I will like to thank you very much all for your presence. And already I announced that on Tuesday, on the 18th, we are hosting this summer school open table discussion about those summer schools in cooperation with IMBAU. And the tickets are free for everybody. So please join us because it will be a very interesting discussion. And then the next talk will be again a continuation of what we talk here about planning policies, design codes. Will be a very interesting discussion on the 13th of March in between Nicholas Boy-Smith and Samuel Hughes. So will not be about details, but will be about all this hidden work of planning and other details that can facilitate or can't facilitate the architect's work, because sometimes they stay in the way, in fact. So I would like to thank you very much again, and mostly to Hugh for this fantastic talk. And I hope to see you again, and I wish you all a good night.
Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. Bye-bye.